So it is a wonderful pleasure to be here with you, Peter. And one of my questions, since you were telling us that in COP27, this is the first time the oceans have been on the agenda, what do you think has taken us so long to understand the link between climate change and ocean health?
Right, so I literally just got off the plane last night. I flew into Boston after a 23 some odd flight back. And our reason for going to COP27, this was the first time that the oceans had been represented as an ocean pavilion within COP27, first time within the blue zone, the diplomatic zone. And our reason for doing this was to really elevate the importance of the ocean in climate solutions. And I think, one of the reasons, or I know one of the reasons that we wanted to do this was really to bring to the world an understanding of the fundamental importance of the oceans in everything we care about. The oceans provide 50% of the oxygen we breathe. The oceans provide every drop of rainfall. The oceans really determine where crops will grow and where they don't. They indicate where heat waves will be and where they won't be. Really, pretty much everything that we ascribe to in human existence has its origins in the oceans, and that's why we went to COP27.
I heard you describe it as the lungs of the planet. I mean, really so vital. And I'm fascinated, given that importance, what are the metrics we should be using to understand the health of the oceans? I mean, what report card would you give us currently, and who are the groups that should be taking the temperatures?
Right, so the oceans are really heroes for us right now. And one of the things that I think is important for all of us to know is that were it not for the oceans, the surface of the Earth would be about 50 degrees warmer than it is today. It'd be completely uninhabitable. And that's because the oceans are taking up about 93% of the excess warming that's coming from rises in greenhouse gases, and about 25 to 30% of the greenhouse gases as well. But the oceans are really the lungs of the planet. They're really providing the breathing of the planet. And really, you can sort of see this if you're imagining arriving at Earth from space. What is it that you see? It's a big blue marble. It's 71% of the surface of the Earth.
So what would those metrics be then? Would you look at ocean acidification, temperature?
So one of the things that we're looking at is when we measure the surface of the Earth, and remember that so much of our understanding of the surface temperatures of the Earth are driven by thermometers on land and the like. But what gives us the ability to capture the larger temperature variation of the whole planet are this armada of floats that exist in the oceans called the Argo floats. And these are actually very dumb robots that pogo stick up and down in the ocean to a depth of about 2,000 meters, and they come up again. And while they're doing this, they're profiling the state variables of the ocean: temperature, salinity, and pressure, sometimes measuring oxygen as well. And what they've been doing is really profiling the temperatures. They go up and down roughly every week, and they drift. They're called Lagrangian floats. They drift with the currents. There's about 4,000 of them in the planet, and they're measuring this accumulation of heat in the oceans. What we've discovered is this growth of heat in the oceans. But also we've discovered that the oceans are becoming deoxygenated, which basically means in the parts of the ocean that are below the surface at a depth of about 1,000 meters or so, there are parts of the ocean that are becoming ever more anoxic. That is, the oxygen is going close to zero. And this is, for example, this is really happening in the Gulf of Mexico and really off the coast of Peru and the like. So what we want to do is really to expand our understanding of the oceans. One of the things that I'd like to tell my students and our staff is that, we know the backside of the moon better than the oceans. We've only explored about 3% of the oceans, and that doesn't even include the vast depths, the interior of the oceans. The satellites really only give us a surface expression of temperature and salinity of what's happening in the oceans, but we have very little insight into the depths.
I've heard you say that given the importance of the ocean, it's almost like a black box to us right now. And you have this vision for setting up the internet of the ocean, or the ocean internet. Maybe you could share a little bit what that would look like.
Right, so one of the really fundamental things that is motivating me right now and the Woods Hole Oceanographic is that we're basically flying blind. The oceans represent the majority of the planet, 70% of the planet, and we have basically no eyes on the health of the ocean. If the ocean were to suddenly die tomorrow, we wouldn't know it. We have no eyes on the ocean and its basic biologic function. And that's just inexcusable at this point when we're seeing such tremendous change on the terrestrial side of things. We can see with our eyes wildfires and floods and all the like that we've seen throughout our lives. We don't have a similar understanding of the oceans. And one of the reasons for this is that it's really hard to translate the kind of measurements that we get from satellites into the oceans. And this is because electromagnetic radiation only penetrates about an inch into the ocean surface. And then you have no GPS, you have no radio communications. So one of the things we've done at the Woods Hole Oceanographic is to develop new forms of undersea communications, mainly through acoustics and using optical communications. So we've developed blue lasers. Blue light travels further in deep waters. And so we can use blue lasers to actually produce modem quality data transmissions and acoustics to provide geolocation. And so we basically have developed this swarming capacity to develop an ocean internet. We call this the Ocean Vital Signs Network. And the idea is to build a data cube in the ocean that's roughly twice the size of Texas, 1 million square kilometers, from the surface of the ocean to the bottom of the ocean, that are monitoring ocean health and changes in ocean function over time, not only as it's changing into the future, but also the ocean's tremendous ability to take up additional carbon.
It is super exciting. I'm thinking as we're sitting here, Peter, you've spent 40 years of your life exploring different parts of the ocean, probably more than most of us will get to. Can you take us on a bit of a journey and tell us, if we all had come with you, what are some of the visible changes that we might have seen and what are some of the invisible changes? I know you've had encounters with Somali pirates and gone to some of these dead zones. I mean, what would we all see if we kind of came with you on all these voyages over time?
All right, well, so one of the things we just saw in the previous talk was really this incredible new perspective that's afforded to you when you're on a vessel. And certainly when you're on a ship in the middle of the ocean, anyone who's sailed on a ship any significant different distance away from the coastline, the first thing you realize is just the vastness of the ocean and the tremendous majesty of the ocean. And as an oceanographer, this is one of the things you most look forward to. But for the most part, it's a lot of hard work. We spend a lot of time building our experiments, building our cruises, and building our ships. But really, one of the things that that I have noticed, a lot of my work was working on polar regions. And so as over the years, as I've sailed further and further north into the Arctic, we absolutely notice the retreat of the sea ice moving further north. It's one of the things it's the fastest changing place on the planet. It's warming at a pace that's roughly 4 times the global average. So one of the most dramatic things you notice is that. The other is that I had one cruise that actually sailed from Yokohama to Vancouver, so across the North Pacific. And you all know what we sailed through, the North Pacific garbage patch. And for the most part, it's a pretty unremarkable thing until you get into the center of it, at which point you're there in the middle of the ocean. Remember what we were talking about, the middle of the ocean, it's one day is like the next. It's just like this big expanse of ocean. But then you do begin to see these accumulations, these islands, if you will, of plastic trash that are in some cases as large as Manhattan and even larger.
Well, and you also described these oxygen dead zones. Can you describe what those look like and where do we find those now and who's tracking that?
So one of the things that we see in the oceans is that, particularly, for example, the runoff from the Mississippi, because it's draining the agricultural interior, is a supply of nutrients out into the ocean. And this flushing of nutrients into the ocean is stimulating greater productivity, which then means as that organic matter sinks through the water column, it consumes all the oxygen at depth. And that is those oxygen minimum zones, those dead zones, if you will, are expanding. And they're beginning to swallow up these ecosystems that are down deep in the ocean. Now, we can't see it, of course, because this is below the surface. But we can see it in terms of the cost of the fish at our fish market. But most importantly is that we can see this, how it's evolving over time, because these dead zones or these oxygen minimum zones are growing. And this is again linked to the fact the oceans are warming. Anybody who's opened a can of your favorite carbonated beverage in the summer knows that if you open up something that's warm, it'll spray all over your lap. And that's because the solubility of the gas, in this case carbon dioxide, wants to come out of the liquid and onto your lap. And that's what's happening with oxygen in the oceans, that as it gets warmer, it holds less oxygen. So that means the oxygen minimum zones are expanding. So these are tremendous changes that are happening in really a relatively short amount of time. And as I mentioned before, we have very few eyes on the process.
And one of the exciting things that we've been tracking is that climate tech will be about 40 billion this year, but we're starting to see the beginnings of blue tech, of PE and other VC firms starting to say, hey, the oceans are so critical, let's invest. I mean, does that play a role in your work at Woods Hole? And what do you think are some of the most exciting investments out there?
Yeah, so the blue economy looks like it's set to double in the next decade or so to roughly $3 trillion. What's driving a lot of that is the need to turn to the ocean for ocean-based climate solutions. So, the most obvious one that I think everyone here is familiar with is offshore wind. It's one of the most scalable ways of developing renewable energy, but other areas include, for instance, aquaculture. But still other areas, is something that I'll be talking about tomorrow, is carbon dioxide removal, ocean-based carbon dioxide removal. The oceans are an incredible reservoir of carbon. They contain roughly 50 times more carbon than exists in the atmosphere. And so that means that if you could sort of magically take the entire excess carbon dioxide problem that is in the atmosphere, if you could take that and mix it like a martini with a swizzle stick in the ocean, it would represent about 1% of that extra carbon into the ocean. But what we want to be most careful about, is really protecting the ocean and understanding that. And so that's really an opportunity not only to develop the strategies, the technologies that could enable that, but also to monitor and to report and to verify those technologies.
Wow. Well, and Woods Hole Oceanographic Institution, which we're so lucky to have down the road in Falmouth, you've been there for 2 years now, and it's so important as, I think, the largest institution studying the ocean. How do you decide what problems are critical enough? I know there are 800 projects in a year and a $300 million budget, but what would you list as, in your mind, the top goals to really focus on?
Right. What we're focusing on right now at the Oceanographic is that we're roughly 1,100 people working there. Most people aren't quite familiar with the size of the Woods Hole Oceanographic. It's been around for nearly a century. As you mentioned, our budget's about $300 million. But that's 85% of that is coming in terms of specific projects for specific PIs, for specific programs. One of the things that we're working on right now is really focusing on ocean-based climate solutions. That is, ways in which ocean science and technology can be used to adapt and mitigate and indeed provide resilient solutions to the climate problem. One thing that we can all understand is that if you look at the Earth from space, it is this blue marble in space. We are an ocean planet. The climate challenge demands solutions, and those solutions can be found in the ocean. So the kinds of things that we're focusing on are ways in which the ocean can take up carbon at scale, and ways that we can monitor that carbon flow. Also, ways in which ocean pharmaceuticals can be used to develop new drugs. So, for example, we have developed a compound based on horseshoe crab blood that's actually used for vaccine development. There's a number of ways in which we can advance the science that we're working on to address solutions to benefit society.
I believe that even helped with COVID, so a lot of us may be beneficiaries with
Exactly.
that. So let me ask a last question. There's so many more. We could probably have a whole symposium just on the oceans, but you have wonderful twin daughters, and they'll be about your age in 2050. Can you give us a sense what new uses you think they'll have for the oceans then, what new challenges, and what you think we have to do today to make sure that the oceans are in good shape in 2050?
Right. So I think actually I'd like to start with the last comment, which is that many of us, when we look at the ocean, we see a victim. We see all the things that are happening to the ocean, the accumulation of plastics, the severe retreat of coral reefs around the planet. And I'm happy to say that one of the things that we're working on, for example, with coral reefs, is developing ways in which to increase their resilience against heat waves, to let them last, to help them be more resilient. In fact, one of the methods that we're developing is actually playing the sound, the acoustic sound of a healthy reef. And it acts kind of like a disco beat track, in that it attracts the additional fish, it attracts fish to thinking it's a healthy reef, and that leads to recolonization of the reef itself. So these kinds of deployments of new technologies can actually lead to the sustaining of coral reefs into the future.
Thank you so much for your leadership. We're really honored to have you at COP27. Really appreciate you flying back in time to join us. And we all know the oceans, anyone who's lucky enough to live on them realizes how critical they are. So thank you very much.
Thanks, Alison.
Thank you.